The following podcast is rated I for intellectual. It contains jargonistic terminology that may be too stimulating for some listeners. Topics discussed are approached with an emphasis towards educational fair use. Critical thinking is advised.
Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics, as well as the Chair of the Adult School of Arts and Sciences at Mid-America Christian University. I would like to welcome you all to our special Topics in Media Studies lecture podcast series, a vodcast, where we are looking at a unique aspect of popular culture. Every course or season of the class, we change topics, and as I've mentioned before, our most recent topic looked at film from a variety of genre perspectives. This time we are examining the area of comics and recognizing that there exists, in fact, a subdiscipline or cross-discipline known as comics studies. But in order to look at comics, we need some comics. We need some material to examine. So for this short course period, we have utilized Frank Miller's iconic Batman, The Dark Knight Rises from 1986, originally collected in four issues or 4 books as they're titled inside, but for our modern purposes, they've been collected into what we refer to as a graphic novel. So that has been our graphic novel of choice. We only went with one because it is an accelerated course cycle. Our wider theme in the class is actually Mythic Media in America. And so one of the things we wanted students to be able to appreciate is that we're not simply trying to connect to study a Batman or superheroes in general. We're interested in this additional larger layer of myth making and how myths get created and circulated in the U.S., right, as an immediate context for us. Sometimes it's too difficult to kind of think about all myths at once. So our focal lens is using that umbrella of America. What kinds of myths and myth making take place in our country, and what does that say about us? How does it reflect our values, our beliefs, our practices, our taste? And so joining me in each and every episode this season has been the chair of the School of Business at BECU, Scott McMurray. And every week, as hopefully you've caught on, Scott is teasing us with his expertly curated backdrops, right? He is master of the Zoom backdrop. I'm rhetorically curious, Scott. We'll momentarily have some access to discuss and pull apart what is going on with your backdrop. I have a feeling we may want to table that and wait until the end of discussion as things unfold. However, for those of you that are in the know, right, not just our mass audience, but our student audience, we have in fact teased a Bat panel, right, a roundtable discussion with several special guests from outside our university body, and it is awesome to bring together these voices to have a unique discussion about Batman, about The Dark Knight Returns, and also how it kind of continues to influence things, perhaps within higher education, within the academy, as we call it, as well as, and sometimes unfortunately, outside of our invisible boundaries of education. So I want to preview each of our speakers here. Give an opportunity to say hello so they can put a face with a name. But first, we have joining us from the University of North Texas, Dr. Karen Anderson-Lain. Karen is the basic course director, as well as an expert in the area of pedagogy. That is to say, like the philosophies of education. And much of her research draws from that well. And as you'll see shortly, I also previewed privately, her work is a perfect tie-in because it kind of connects some points between Batman and learning and learning about learning. Karen, welcome. Thank you for taking a little time out of your schedule.
Thank you so much, Garrett.
All right, and additionally, we have if Scott and I have represented one form of dynamic duo, at least in this lecture podcast series, Dr. Anderson-Lain has a dynamic duo of her own on a scholarly level, and that is our second guest, Kyle Hammonds, who is currently with and representing the University of Oklahoma, where he's continuing a fantastic and interesting research avenue, not only into topics like Batman, but also cults, cult behavior, cult activities, and some white hot research topics. Kyle, hello.
Hello, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then also joining us is Oklahoma City's own Brian Berlin. Brian is a denizen of the OKC metro area, and he is the purveyor of ground level comics knowledge, right? He's got his ear to the masses because he's owner and operator of New World Comics in Oklahoma City. Brian, thank you for taking some time out of the schedule. Who knows if what could possibly happen, because it looks like you're coming to us from your very own Batcave of sorts.
Yeah, I'm here in the shop. It's getting ready to open, so there might be some people walking around behind me soon. But yeah, I'm super happy to be here, and hopefully I sound more or less educated, and hopefully I'll be a wealth of knowledge.
This is fantastic, absolutely. And of course, Scott, any opening words or diatribes of jest that you want to share with us here?
Well, I'd love to do a diatribe, but we don't have time. So just glad to be here with what a great group to talk about this and to wrap up this series. I think that it's a real good chance to bring in some different perspectives and hear some new voices. So let's get to it.
Excellent. All right. Well, I've switched locations, right? Hopefully it's not revealing my true identity too much. But we had a little bit of camera one failure. We've switched to camera two. The way it always goes, right? When things are changing on a dime. To queue up our guest panelists, the way that this season of Special Topics has unfolded, we took the unique nature of The Dark Knight Returns, which is organized into 4 parts, and we explored a single book or part in each of our first 4 episodes. And so it was a chance to really break it down, kind of perform a live type of textual analysis, really, but look at some narrative themes and really span the spectrum of what that time allotted us. We then pulled back for the 5th penultimate episode and looked at the larger influence of The Dark Knight Returns. We looked at how this is a text that has not only left its imprint economically, as something to kind of fawn over for fans and readers, this sort of thing, but it is tremendously influenced its industry, right? We've seen the tone of superhero comics change as a result. We've seen the tone. It really helped spark the right maybe tone that helped the film genre become reinvigorated. 2 cycles of Bat films successfully drew influence from it. And I pause. 3, now that I think about it, right? There are aspects of Miller's DNA present in this book that continue to influence it, and it's hard to really step outside of that, not to say you can't. And so we looked at those wider influences and had that kind of conversation. That the influences expand so much so that over the years there have been many published works about Batman, about the Dark Knight Returns, and so it's an opportunity to explore some of those scholarly works. But also, as we segue into this this finale, this episode 6, we want to talk about um, the continued resonance of that, and I see that unfolding on a couple of fronts. But I think one of the ways that we can orient ourselves and familiarize our guests is to hear from you, maybe some of your familiarity and experience with the character. So if we can kind of do a bit of a round robin, no pun intended, Karen and then Kyle and Brian, would you all be willing to share what is your background familiarity with Batman? Right, where did you first kind of come into connection with the character or variations of the many texts in this world?
So at least for me, Batman started with really a watching with my grandfather reruns of Adam West and watching that on syndicated television. I might be showing my age a little bit. And so I was first introduced to Batman as this like campy kind of superhero, very lighthearted, where the notion of the crime and that element really was different. And it was in the late 90s that I actually I first kind of really read the Dark Knight, and it's been a while since I've read it. That was really my exposure at that time, and it really does show a different, a sharp contrast to that Adam West Batman, the grittiness of it. And so that's where my initial experience comes from. And my most recent experience is actually working with Kyle on examining Year One, which Frank Miller wrote as an origin story to set up the stage for the Dark Knight Rises.
And my early experiences with Batman came from Batman the Animated Series in the 90s, and I continue to refer back to those episodes, both for pleasure and for pedagogical usages. I watched an episode this morning before I hopped on this Zoom session. So my students have really enjoyed watching episodes from time to time, and they've provided some examples for some of our class communication concepts from time to time. But especially as a child, I was particularly taken in by the sort of contrast between very visually sort of gritty, dark aesthetics contrasted with, in that particular series, the very optimistic sort of tone, which I thought was inspiring to look for the ways that one can help other people. That series particularly honed in on how Bruce Wayne tried to help other people around him and use his resources for that. So that's something that I valued in that series. And then my first sort of foray into Batman comics came shortly before the movie The Dark Knight came out. And that's because I was trying to read about the source materials that Christopher Nolan said he was drawing from in creating that movie. And so the first major Batman graphic novel that I read was The Long Halloween by Loeb and Sale. It is to this day my favorite graphic novel. And so that inspired me to launch into Batman comics. And now I have a shelf that can't contain them all that started with The Long Halloween. So that's my background with Batman.
Yeah. And then I suppose my introduction to Batman was I got taken to the 1989 Batman movie, and right after it let out, my aunt took me to the KB toy store, and they had like a 4-pack of Batman comics, and I've been hooked on comics ever since.
This is awesome, and it really feeds into a second related question that I had for us. which has to do with what mass medium did you first encounter Batman? And these responses have collectively been remarkable, because what they're demonstrating to us is that we enter a sort of textual relationship with these artifacts through various mass mediums. And just for those lay students recalling this kind of jargon and language we're using, it, a mass medium is the distinct and differentiated channel with which we communicate or receive a communication exchange. And Karen mentioned the 60s TV series Adam West. And for our students, and we've had some of this conversation on our message board in the class these past 5 weeks, many of them had that experience with the Adam West, the campy 60s TV series, relatively short-lived, only 3 seasons, but produced a wealth of episodes. It aired twice a week, but it, not unlike the original Star Trek, also 3 seasons, this show transcended its short-lived existence on CBS, right? Both series, in fact, but instead carried on for decades in syndication, right? What we used to refer to as reruns on TV. Whereas Kyle is coming at us from a different TV avenue, and that is children's programming, right? This is an entirely different experience, right? This concept of media created directly for and to influence children. Except it wasn't, was it? It's quite mature. Batman the Animated Series was. In fact, I love using it to talk about, when Batman the Animated Series first arrived, it coincided with the advent of the TV rating system. And the TV rating system was kind of put in place, not necessarily because of Batman, but it was like the films of the 1980s in the way that they led to sort of ushered in the PG-13, because we had a hard time drawing this line between what should qualify as PG for general, for family audiences, and what should qualify as R. And shows like NYPD Blue, right, with adult language and partial nudity, this sort of thing, right? These infamous butt shots, especially Dennis Franz. But these shows on broadcast TV were sort of changing the rules, and we there were created new rules to kind of help guide that. And so, these distinct experiences, but Brian also highlighted film, of course, right? One of those prominent mediums of the 20th century, at least the most sort of alluring from a visual avenue. And none of these started with comics, right? They led to comics, which I think is important. And it's worth noting because our students even report it's more common for a student entering a class like this to have never read a comic than to have read any comic. Let's say comic strips on the backs of newspapers aside. Although that is increasingly right, less and less, because we have fewer newspapers than ever circulating. Just for a healthy recap, I didn't mean to leave you out. Scott, tell us about your first encounter with Batman. What was that like? How did you encounter the Dark Knight?
Oh, yeah, I was starting to feel a little lonely over here. I thought you didn't care about me. We've actually talked a little bit about this, you and I, so I won't drag it out, but I'm probably easily the oldest person on this feed. I was a kid reading comics in the 70s, in even the late 60s, but probably preteen in the 70s and the mid 70s. If you think about that 70s show, that's me. I graduated high school in 79. So in the early 70s, unfortunately, that's when I was reading comics. And as we have discussed before, for comics and country music, the 70s were not, maybe not the best. And so my first experience with Batman is Batman in the comics we were all big comic readers, but the storylines tended to be straight narrative, still moralistic. Everybody thought it was weird that Batman kept a boy in his cave, and so he wasn't. I was a big fan of Spider-Man because Spider-Man was younger and he was a wisecracker and he was funny. Batman was, Batman was, again, a lot more. My recollection of the comics is a lot more like the Adam West version on TV, sort of a Sherlock Holmes in a cape, emphasizing really his cooperation with the police and avoiding a lot of the issues that we find later. Fast forward to 1986, and so I've not been reading comics for, I've, like everybody else, I have to go get a full-time job. I'm not lucky like Brian, where I can make reading comics my full-time job. I still aspire to that, though. If you want a successor, Brian, I'll be happy to do that. But was going to school and reading serious stuff and got married. By 1986, I was married almost 2 years, had my first child in 86, just about the time that this came out. I was telling Garrett that I remember being in Crossroads Mall, and I'm guessing, Brian, that was the KB store you went to, maybe. But it's, if you're an Oklahoma City denizen, but they used to have a hobby store down in the bottom. It had a huge life-size, as I recall, it was the monster from the Black Lagoon, maybe. But if you remember that store, but they also carried, they had the Dark Knight Returns when it came out. And so as Robin is wheeling baby around and doing shopping, I stood in there and read this graphic novel, and it just blew me away. It presents as serious, thoughtful literature, which obviously has themes that I still think are worth considering at an adult level, and a whole new approach to using this character. And probably the last time we'll get to say this, since this is part 6, but themes that were so critically important in the bigger society at that time. Violence in the cities, the threat of nuclear annihilation was felt in a way that we haven't felt it since the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. This is the same year as Watchmen, which frankly is a series that I got into a lot more than Batman. But Frank Miller single-handedly sort of yanked me up into what the comics could be. What they weren't just funny books; these were serious, talented artists, talented writers, discussing in the context of these well-known heroes potential solutions to real-life problems. So Frank Miller, I owe him my allegiance.
All right. If Frank Miller is anything like his Batman, then he will accept your allegiance. You speak of.
Maybe he'll make me his ward. Do you think?
I don't know if you want that role. Well, paging Carrie, right? Paging Carrie Kelly. You mentioned serious, right, themes emerging along adult literature, and I did find my copy of Paradise Lost, right? I just want to make sure people know I'm not pretending to be searching for a copy in our previous discussion. It was like the serpent. It was just hiding right off to the side.
We were both wanting to make allusions to it, and we couldn't remember it for 5 minutes. Couldn't remember the name of John Milton's famous epic, so we looked like we were completely faking it.
This is true. Like the Red Dragon, I'm going to have to tattoo, some of the iconography onto my back so that I can remember it. Right? Not for my own clandestine purposes, just simply to remember for random oral citations when necessary. You all have done a great job kind of kicking off this conversation about demonstrating the mass media dexterity of the text. And a question that I had for those that teach or in higher ed, right? So for three of our panelists, what about Bat-Man makes this a viable vehicle for scholarly interest or scholarly investigation? Because I bet an average student might look and say, well, what's the difference, right? And this could even be an opportunity to share some of your work and help us understand better what that looks like and how it applies. Karen?
Well, I actually think that Kyle would be great to start us off, because it really was Kyle's passion for Bat-Man that led to me working with him and teaching with Bat-Man in a course that we had at the University of North Texas. And so I actually would love for Kyle to speak about it first, and then I would feel free to add my 2 cents in if that works for you, Kyle.
That's fantastic. Kyle, tell us a little bit about your work. Where did this come from? Take us to the origin story, right, of your inspiration and what's come about from this labor.
Yes. Well, Bat-Man in particular seems to have captured scholarly attention in a way that other superheroes maybe have not. There is, volumes on volumes on volumes which have been written about Batman, and other superhero characters have perhaps some scholarly writing about them, but it's nowhere near the same sort of amount of labor that's gone into it. And different writers have different justifications for that, but much of it has to do with the way that the folks who have worked on Batman took his psychology so seriously. And so they wanted the character to be sort of tackling problems that people could see in society outside of the comics texts. And when I first started working on my master's degree, we were coming off of The Dark Knight Rises, the end of Christopher Nolan's trilogy, and there was talk about Batman versus Superman happening. And in the midst of that, I had purchased this book by a professor of psychology named Travis Langley, and he teaches a class on Batman and psychology. And I thought, well, I'm curious about what this guy has to say, so I started reading through the book. And I thought, this is really interesting. This person has found a way to use Batman to explore real things outside of comic books, and to use that as a tool to teach his students. And I thought, I wonder if there's any way to do that for the discipline that I'm in, communication, as well. And I started talking about it with Karen and sharing some of the ideas, connections that I saw between the basic course textbook and the concepts that were in it, and seeing those things reflected in some of the Batman comics that I had been reading. And so I proposed that we introduce Batman comics to try and give an example of some of those concepts, and to work as a conversation starter for students to work from. And that way they're not just perhaps struggling to pull from personal examples, or feeling like, maybe students aren't completely ready to start sharing personal stories about some concepts about challenges in society. And so having a fictional example to kind of pull from to start talking about those social issues and theorizing about those social issues seemed to be helpful. And so I'm very grateful that as soon as I started bringing up the topic with Karen, she was immediately on board and really helped facilitate that and acted as a partner in creating those courses.
Karen, as we get set to kind of hear a little bit about this process from your perspective, something that immediately stands out to me is that you're a rather large university, and running any basic course is going to come with some complications, simply in terms of the volume of students that you're encountering. Can you talk a little bit about how do you navigate knowing that diversity of student body representation, and then how do you go about selecting and let alone implementing a work like this to kind of help service some educational outcomes?
Yeah, so our introduction to communication class that we did the Bat-Man class in is a entry-level class that focuses on building interpersonal and group communication and public speaking skills. And we really use a framework of understanding the role of communication and being an advocate in your life. And so we framed that through the discussion of social issues. So we had already had in the course a social issue and advocacy focus. And so when Kyle was looking at interconnections, he was tapping into trying to find a popular culture narrative that intersected both with his interests, but also with that social issue advocacy focus that the course has. And so our intro class already challenges our student body to step outside of their assumptions, to look at different cultural and diverse perspectives, and to look at their role in their social and public lives. And so with that in mind, we really were trying to find a text that had, I think, mass appeal, but also that the instructor, in this case, Kyle, was passionate about. Because as a teacher, I'm a huge proponent of two key aspects to pedagogy. One is trying to meet the students where they are, and popular culture does that. And the other is some level of self-disclosure or authenticity of the instructor. Because if you teach from an authentic place where you are, and you can tap into interests that your students have, the intersection of that can be really meaningful dialogue. And so I thought it was a great connection. And I think it provides a framework, whether it's Bat-Man or any other piece of popular culture. It's utilizing that narrative to connect with the course goals. And I think it's a much deeper way of exploring popular culture in the classroom through the story sharing and building a dialogue around it than just one-off popular culture examples. And so it really was a full integration throughout the entire course, from the specific assignments that were used to the class discussion that truly integrated the graphic novel throughout the entire semester. And that's very unique. A lot of pop culture is just one-off examples.
Let me build off of that response as I hope to also hear Scott's input, because he's coming from a completely different discipline than most of us. But when I hear you talking about the authenticity of the instructor, I'm certainly an advocate and kind of share that opinion. But you mentioned also the one-off nature of certain books, and I can see where year one, because it's an origin story and a well-told one and relatively self-contained, it lends itself to a wider readership. I think that's one of the most challenging aspects of picking a work for broad audience introduction. And I'm sure in a couple of minutes we can hear from Brian on that topic of how do you sell, how do you suggest and locate the kinds of works that are going to make sense to people in a medium, at least with superheroes, but also other stories that is laden with continuity heavy serialization, right? Which is so exciting. It's what rewards and sustains reader interest, but it also can alienate new readers. This was a challenge, and so self-disclosure about our class experience. This was a challenge for us. I mentioned before we start, a majority of the students happen to not be comm majors this time, and so they're not familiar with how our courses are arranged or run. Some of the topical jargon or terminology that we would engage, and also how do you select a work that's sort of both iconic and representative and reader friendly. It's tricky. I wrestled with it by week 2, I was concerned. You know, we had overly what do you say, a majority female class, and this is not a discrepancy, but we understand collectively that the comics medium historically was heavily skewed in a writerly direction toward male readers, and so, you know, I wrestle with issues concerning can this text still relate to us? Does it retain that viability? Is it insensitive in certain ways? And comics, there are those notorious threads about, you know, certain aspects, or maybe creators or storylines or characters that are what we now refer to as toxic, right? Um, the books are hyper masculine, just as they are also hyper feminine, right? Because this is fantasy, but that can, you know, to use the Marxian term, alienate readers at times, create distance. And I think thus the importance of having these conversations, not just plopping a book in someone's lap. But with that being said, Scott, do you want to share with us, or really Brian, how do you go about selecting a text to recommend to you know, customers that come in the store?
Yeah, basically, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. I'll talk to people and you know, ask them, you know, kind of what they're looking for, what their interests are, and base it off that. If they've never read any comics before, I ask them what kind of movies or TV shows that they like, and you can usually find something relatable. And typically, one of the go-tos is Batman, just because you know, there's so much to the lore that's relatable. You know, everyone understands loss, and that's, you know, the big driving force behind Batman is loss, and that sense of you know, searching for justice and taking care of you know, those kind of problems, and just exemplifying the human spirit of you know, if you work hard enough and try hard enough, your determination is going to solve all your problems. So that's kind of the easiest go-to for a lot of that. Yeah, it's just kind of a you know, finding where people can get their common grounds, so to speak, and then from there you can find you know, you had mentioned these long-running series that could alienate people. It's trying to explain it to everyone that it's like meeting a friend for the first time. You know that there's a lot of history that went on before then, but if you get on you know, at a certain point, it's going to explain a lot of the history as you're going forward too. So it's kind of rough at first, but you know, as long as you stick with it, you know, you can become included and part of what you're reading.
I like that comparison a lot, and this idea of, you know, uh, characters and shared universes and worlds. They give us, they satisfy a need, right? They satisfy a need it's quite psychological. We're craving, right? Humans crave communication, encounter, and depending on, you know, whether you're more extroverted versus introverted, I think these books certainly satisfy a lot of those. These are innately human desires, right? Not just the spectacle of some of the storytelling itself. Scott, where could a book like this tie in or fit in with some of the curriculum that you're most familiar with?
Well, if used correctly, almost anywhere. You know, and that's a cheap answer, so I will elaborate and make it a more expensive one. I'll use bigger words. But, you know, I see myself, this is a very interesting conversation, because I see myself as kind of a bridge between the purely academic pursuit of communications, mass media production, and the business world. I have an MLA, so I do have an interest in the literary form, but I'm the majority of my training, my education, and my experiences in business. So I'm very keen on a couple of aspects. One, a person like Brian is aware, like the rest of us, that not only are these stories, they're also products. And so it's, when we have talked before about the way that the ability to market the character or market the series ends up affecting the narrative or the way that the character is written, because you have consumers of that character that want to identify with it. But I would also say that we have woefully, painfully neglected in business practice the importance of understanding exactly what we've been over in the corner talking about in comm and mass media this whole time, and that is, in the modern world, what is selling? It's building narrative. It's associating a product or a service with a story, with a condition that people want to relate themselves to. We live in a complex economy where people have many choices, and as I hope we get to talk about, the images behind me when we get down to the end of this are a demonstration that people carry these icons, these narrative characters, into other aspects of their life. It's not just a figure in what they buy and how they spend their money. It's their politics and how they live their life and how they describe their moral code. So we've been guilty in all academic disciplines of getting off in a corner and saying and refusing to look at how these things work together. I think that in our particular situation, this is particularly applicable to our marketing students, because we've asked them throughout this series to consider how the intended audience, ultimately, if you want your comic to continue, you have to be able to sell it. And so, how are the expectations and the needs of the continuing audience affecting the way that the story itself is developed, and to consider how you look at Batman as a product in 1966 and how that had to change if you're going to sell Batman in 2019. You can't. Adam West doesn't cut it, except maybe as a object of parody, of humor. But it's not culturally current. And I would love to hear Brian's ideas about his clientele as consumers, in terms of, does he feel like what drives them to invest? And we are talking about investment, as we discussed a little bit before you got on, Garrett. The way that maybe the digital media is actually driving people to consider investing in the physical books themselves, whereas before they wouldn't have been exposed to them. But that can add up. I mean, these special editions and the hardbacks, it can add up to an investment that people are willing to make. And I believe, like with almost everything we buy, they are doing that to realize some expression of their positionality, what they believe in, what they want to talk about. That's why you get so much cosplay, I think, is people wanting to relate in an even deeper, more emotional level about, that I stand for these values or these ideals in some way. I'd be really interested to hear what Brian has to say about what drives his customers to make these purchases.
You could say that as people are buying things, They're getting these things, and then the stuff becomes representative of them. If you really want to dive into the psychology of purchasing, and some people come in just looking for various stories that just to entertain and relax and see other aspects to their interests, and some just want to have the sense of completion. And you had mentioned the digital aspect of comic reading consumption. We're finding that the availability through digital means is now also helping to translate to physical media sales, because people will come in and see kind of what they were after, and then be interested in other things that are similar. So it's just kind of all over the place whenever it comes to the motivation to get into comics. Some have heard from it, through movies, TV shows. Some people have comics handed down to them, through their family members, friends, whatever. Some honestly get into it from an academic standpoint. Like in their college courses, they're told, hey, you have to read Dark Knight Returns, you have to read Year One, you have to read Watchmen. And from there, they realize, oh, these things really speak to me, and they want in.
Brian,
I'm curious, Brian. I just want to ask Brian, as a purveyor of specialty merchandise,
yes,
do you find that your role as a mentor, as a content expert, is something that people want to experience as part of that decision to purchase?
On some of it, and then it's kind of the double-sided coin. Some people come knowing that we know more than most, and sometimes people come in interested in some of the stuff. Will ask us questions, and then we'll get online and see what other bloggers have said about the things that I recommend. So it's kind of the some people really believe what I have to say, and some people don't trust me because they think I'm just trying to get the first dollar I can.
Brian, I would suggest, at least from my observations over the years, that your location is quite unique in some ways. We have our, I just say we, like as a consumer society, there's the annual Free Comic Book Day, right? This has become a great marketing tool over the years, and it's worthy of mentioning because this was quite the distressful year economically, or obviously, nationally, globally, but locally. And Free Comic Book Day, to my understanding, was canceled, right? This and a different kind of cancel culture. But the consumer side took enormous hits. But in my experiences of maybe like taking the kids out, checking out Free Comic Book Day, your location is special. You have seemingly a community, right? The sons and daughters of Brian Man, who are dressing up and celebrating more than any of these other locations. So I'm always reminded of the communal nature of comics fans, and that fandom side really is kind of encouraged and allowed to celebrate at New World in a special way. In fact, maybe you could talk about how you transition some of that energy and passion into your own Saturday morning series. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I'd be glad to. Yeah. I noticed that anytime that I held an event, if I had someone dressed up as Spider-Man or Batman or any comic character, sales were boosted. we would see more foot traffic, and I realized that there's something there's something psychological to seeing your person from the page to seeing them just in real life. There's just part of you that's 5 again and so super excited about the whole thing. And I realized that we could get kids ready for comic reading more so if they met their characters first before they delved in, because it's one thing to know who Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman are, but if you're reading a Justice League book and you pick it up and you see Metamorpho or Red Tornado, you don't know who they are, and that's going to slow you down. But what we've done is I get my friends, my family, very nice souls that are willing to put up with the costumes I shove them in, to come out and talk to kids about who they are and what they do. And then the kids get to ask questions. And, sometimes we'll put on kind of a skit. Sometimes, we have things planned. And sometimes it's just question and answer. And we've seen a huge return on it. And from doing our Saturday morning superhero schools, that's led to doing charitable things in the community, which led to us putting on a comic convention that's annual now. And it's just kind of blown up from there that, it's interesting to see what you can find relatable from each of these characters. Because, take Batman, take Superman, take Wonder Woman. Most people are going to be coming at these characters from many different angles, and yet they still find the same answer in them. And while I'm here being a talking head, I just wanted to say before I forgot, I love that we're all being talking heads while talking about The Dark Knight Returns. Like, it's just extra meta.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the heat wave to start on this thing. Usually this time of year,
I just want to mention, Brian, you need to know, because Garrett's a little shy about this. He would really like to dress up as Robin, so you might.
It's not true.
You would have to shave. You would need to shave, Garrett.
No tights.
Part of my own superhero origin, I found that the older I get, if I shave entirely, I look a lot more like my dad than I'm comfortable with. So I have to keep my identity concealed, right? I lost my train of thought. This is fantastic, Brian. It was great here. This superhero school really is an interesting thing, and something that came to mind, especially since we've talked about animated series, and Kyle mentioned Batman the animated series, and cartoons play this role. Cartoons, sometimes they've given us a misconception of what superheroes are supposed to be, or yet they also are. But what your superhero school reminds me of is it is this replacement, it's fixing what we've lost. I say only a couple of generations got to enjoy this and appreciate it, but this idea of Saturday morning cartoons went away corporately, right? It was decided by people that make money for a living, but Saturday morning cartoons are just this kind of like fantastical time where children could take in a media type that was designed to speak to them, and it was systematically phased out, right? It wasn't profitable enough or whatever. And what I really appreciate about your superhero school is you're creating an avenue. And sure, certainly there are tie-ins. We live in, as Henry Jenkins, Sam Ford, and Joshua Green tells, a spreadable media culture, right? A convergence culture. We understand this, but part of being opaque, part of being transparent rather about these means do help legitimize that we can create community and make personal investments in tandem, in conversation with one another. And if they're building community along the way, well, then they're more enriching investments of time and money. Scott, great questions. I'm glad you were able to kind of steer that in. Speaking of trying to make those connections with students, I mentioned before, early on, we ask a question of familiarity with the class, and so many of them really authentically had not only not read a Batman comic, it's surprising to even see people now say they've never even seen a Batman film. So it had me internally just being meditative and contemplative about whether or not Batman still resonates in the same way. And I think it's a kind of conversation piece that can go in multiple directions here. I'm in the middle section of our course, I was starting to have that feeling of, has time expired, right? This was a meta experience, right? When we're dealing with the narrative of Bruce Wayne, who has fallen out of vogue and wrestling with, coming back into the fold as an extremist vigilante. But I was having this kind of internal reflection on, have we passed the point of Batman's resonance, or did it happen as a result of oversaturation, right? And I think I'm of the camp that when Hollywood producers recycle series too quickly without giving enough breathing space, we reach an exhaustion point immediately. I feel like they were caught at the end of the Christopher Nolan trilogy with wanting more, and yet that was sort of complete in its own aesthetic way. But then they forged right ahead, right, to kind of integrate him into this new DC entertainment universe, or whatever we're calling it. Same thing happened with Spider-Man, right? You had your Sam Raimi trilogy that was revered. Wasn't even necessarily supposed to be a trilogy, but they made it that. This is Hollywood acts just like comic creators, right? They're retconning things left and right, and redesign the soft reboot. I mean, they're just ripe with this kind of industry jargon that speaks to, well, whatever the market dictates. We're more than happy to kind of comment on. But I have a two-part question, really, for everybody. At first, I felt like, I was starting to gather this impression. Is it time? Cyclically, so it's a question about cycles. Primus here, thinking about cycles, the nature of cycles, whether it's economic or cultural or political or religious or what have you. Is Batman now in a stasis phase, right? Do we need to move away from these darker themes, or perhaps we're seeing new and immediate resonance from the page, and a reason to kind of, once again, kind of gaze into the abyss here and explore this character in the series, and maybe what it reflects about us. Comments, thoughts?
Well, I actually would say that I think a lot of times our students think they know who a particular character is based on the mythos, but they don't really know, because they actually haven't. They've only seen memes and heard people talk about it, and maybe they haven't watched the films, or they haven't read the graphic novels. And so I think there's an opportunity to reshape and have them come to a new understanding of the mythos that is there, and understand it in a different way. And I think part of what Kyle and I talk about in the academic work we've done together is the importance of whatever medium you select from popular culture having to have relevant topics to their lived experiences. And as long as Batman, the source material, continues to explore topics that are relevant to our students' everyday lives, I think that it could be a relevant tool for education. It may ask them to step outside of their comfort zone, read something they haven't read before, but they don't know those interconnections that they're missing. And I think part of our job as faculty members, as instructors, and maybe even Brian as a purveyor of popular culture as educative just in and of itself, is to guide our readers and our students to materials that have that kind of temporal relevance, that can ask them to think about themselves. And I really do think that this is the same place where I come back to the issues of comics and graphic novels that have hypermasculinity, objectification of women issues is that, yes, absolutely, that is the issue, but that doesn't mean that you stop looking at that material. Instead, you ensure that your conversation about that material offers a critique of it and asks, why is this problematic? What should we be doing differently in our lived experience? How does this point, help us understand where there are issues in society that need to be addressed? How is it reflective of those issues? And so I don't think we need to stop looking at those things. I think we just need to make sure we're looking at them critically.
Often the most productive conversations I felt like in facilitating the classes that Karen and I designed were when students observed things in the year one graphic novel that they were a bit uncomfortable with. And so sometimes maybe students would be hesitant to say there's something wrong with the comic book at first if they think that the instructor is super into it and loves the comic and they don't want to like hurt that person's feelings or something. And so occasionally I would offer my own critiques of some of the things in the early issues. And soon thereafter, students started saying, well, hey, there are these other things that don't feel quite right that maybe I don't agree with. And so they would start conversations among themselves based on that kind of social critique. And so I agree that modeling social critique of the comics for students does give them an opportunity to have these really robust discussions of how they feel about how those social issues are represented in the comics and how they feel about maybe where they see those things outside of comics now. And perhaps in a different direction in regard to the question about cycles, I do think that the media like film and television in regard to Batman particularly are sometimes kind of trailing the comics. And so right now it seems like the mainline Batman comics are not quite as steeped in the same kind of grit and cynicism that perhaps we saw in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And so perhaps the movies will start moving in that direction soon. But I agree that maybe we are in a cycle where on film, people are still very interested in exploring the kind of grit of the character, but maybe socially right now, we're becoming exhausted perhaps with the kind of postmodern cynicism that we might feel steeped in our day-to-day activities. And so I would expect that maybe when Batman on film starts exploring, taking social issues seriously, but maybe doesn't feel so chained to the kind of grit of earlier iterations of the character, that maybe we'll see people start feeling a bit more connected to him again too.
I can recall a time when the character was getting into that grim and gritty mode again, right? The initial and middle period of Christopher Nolan's films, and it was he had struck the right level of pastiche, right? It was rooted in a kind of critique and response to 9/11 and as an outside auteur reading the collective conscious of America's response to that. This is written all over, particularly the middle film, the Dark Knight, but it plays out as well in The Dark Knight Rises. The capper there is these themes of how we respond to trauma, and do we go overboard, and are we too preoccupied with a kind of vengeance rather than reconciliation and true rehabilitation. I think that's part of, I would say, the wider mythology in American history is we get entirely excited by and maybe preoccupied in the dramatic storytelling of our own history, and we're utterly fascinated, sometimes morbidly fascinated, by tales of war, tragic loss, and that kind of maybe like hyper masculine emphasis doesn't like to, if we're dwelling on resolution, on rehabilitation, well then we're closing the story, right? that's the sign that we're capable of moving on. And of course, I would suggest this is where we get locked into that tension of, it's a serialized storytelling medium and a character we want to continuously kind of reinvest in terms of adventures and so on, but yet the true healing would is in essence remedy and strip away some of the kind of habitual in media res, right? The action as always ongoing, always unfolding, and we don't have true resolve there. But I think about something I study and write about, the American West and westerns, the film western genre in particular, and there's a reason we're still struggling with many of the issues that took place then, as for so long we whitewashed and sort of revised history and kind of repainted it, right? We resculpted it in our own image, and there wasn't enough account of the plurality of cause and effects, right? Of near annihilation of certain people groups, and certainly that homogenization of multiple cultures. The immigration story of America, right? Certain immigrant narratives are championed, they're glorified. I mean, John Ford, right, one of the great American filmmakers ever, and an archetype of the American Western, was, he glorified the Irish immigrant tale, he himself sharing those types of roots, whereas it was only later in his career when he began a kind of revisionist reflection on the plight of the Native American, and not only what happened there, but how Hollywood and the film industry helped reshape the way we looked at our own past. And I think entertainment has to negotiate and make those choices. But on the topic of Batman, I sense that my instinct is that Hollywood doesn't want to move away from the grim and the gritty. And when I was in the mix of that, I can remember going into maybe a New World Comics, and Brian, you'd have like Batman and Brave and the Bold episodes. I've seen the animated series playing in there before too, but I remember recalling Batman, I think it was the Brave and the Bold. Is that what it was called? I wasn't as all in on that show because it was coming out at a time where I was craving something darker, something more mature, and I didn't want to be faced with the lighthearted end of the spectrum anymore. I had that in the youth when I was watching reruns, but you were someone I could observe. You just kind of had a jovial spirit about you. You were just able to just embrace and enjoy the culture for what it was in that aspect. What's the secret to being able to kind of just toggle between various interpretations of a character?
Well, with that, it's kind of that Batman has been many different people over the years, even though it's kind of the same guy. But you have your people who you're like, so tell me about Batman, and they'll say, well, my Batman is Adam West. My Batman is Michael Keaton. My Batman is the grim and gritty guy. My Batman is the Christopher Nolan stuff. My Batman's Val Kilmer. So you have the wide spectrum, and it's that accessibility that keeps the character relevant. And you had mentioned the ongoing soft reboot. Anytime a different writer will come on the series, they'll always bring a different perspective to it. One of the comic runs that just finished was out of the New 52. Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo did a soft reinterpretation of Batman to where he was the ultimate detective, the world's greatest superhero, the perfect man who was super grim and gritty, but also had a big mech suit that would fight giant monsters. He had a bat missile. He has a contraption that will make another Batman if he dies. So it's just all over the place, and you can just kind of find your Batman and stick with it. And to say that your Batman is the animated series Batman almost closes you off from so many other interpretations. It's like saying I only have one friend. Like I only recognize my friend from high school. Like that's I don't want to go any further with that relationship, because it's ever changing, ever evolving. So Batman is so many other things to so many people, and he himself is the amalgamation of so many different things in comics. Like he's a Dick Tracy derivative, but also he's part the Shadow. He's so many other things that come in to make this character that is not necessarily just one character.
I'm really looking forward to the up and coming version of Batman that wrestles with dad bod syndrome, right?
Yeah, the oh god, what's the actor's name?
After he has a child with Catwoman, I don't want to know any spoilers. I want, what does Batman look like once he's put on a few more pounds, right? Not from CrossFit. You brought up something I think is an important segue for us, Brian, and it's kind of this final thread of conversation that I'd really like to be able to hold for a couple of minutes here. And you mentioned this idea that one of the most recent incarnations was a Batman that could straddle all these lines, that he was the world's greatest detective, that he's still powerful in a grim and gritty way, but he's also warm enough to kind of have a semi-family of his own, the perfect man, in other words, and the Ubermensch, right? I'm reminded of how this is an often sought fantasy, right? That we look for these impossible formulas in our leaders all the time, right? We want. I was thinking about libertarians this morning, and like the ultra libertarian wants extremely strong president, extremely strong omnipotent military, and then like every freedom in the world. Like I don't want everything freedom. I want you to leave me alone. So in other words, it made me think of the U.S. as like Studio 54. We want great armed bodyguards at the door, and but just like the ability to operate like hedonism at whatever we can think of inside the doors, right? And we're more complicated than that, and it's hard to be it's hard to facilitate power with an even-keeled hand, and we see society wrestling with this right now. And Scott, you have a very fascinating real life pair of backdrops this week. We've seen mass mediated incarnations of Batman every week from a different era as your background. This week you have two that are actually drawn from the real world. Can you talk about where you've located these? Maybe share it.
Just I found this to be an astounding confirmation of the whole premise that we've been dealing with, that Batman and the characters in Batman have assumed this kind of iconographic significance in the culture. These are both photographs from yesterday in Philadelphia at the George Floyd protests, which are engulfing many of the major metropoli, including right here in Oklahoma City. I had no idea. Downtown, there's a protest. In Philadelphia yesterday, two individuals showed up. One dressed as the Joker from the recent Joaquin Phoenix iteration of that character. I don't know if you can see his sign. It says "Justice for George." And right there in the middle of the burning streets, the smoke from the fires that have been set, and maybe tear gas, I don't know, a Batman character showed up dressed completely like Batman. If you go out and watch the videos online of both of these characters, they are completely in character. The Batman character stalks silently through the crowd, very ambiguous representation, but generally taken as support for the protest and perhaps criticism of the validity of law enforcement, something that we see in Dark Knight Returns very clearly, is that even the good guys are compromised, and so Batman is equally pursued by villains and by law enforcement. Now occupies this ambiguous middle ground, liminal. I'll borrow that. Garrett's favorite word is liminal. So if you want to be his friend, just say liminal. But it's this liminal presence that Batman kind of occupies as a symbol of justice, but unclear exactly how that might play out. The Joker, on the other hand, I would be interested in the panel's ideas. If you've been able to watch the most recent the movie Joker, Joaquin Phoenix wins an Academy Award for Best Actor. I know Garrett and I have both seen it. Very challenging, but very, very resonant, I think, with what a lot of the society is feeling in terms of being completely disfranchised. I mean, there's a point where you say, the game is rigged, and, we have to burn this down before anything can be fixed. In other words, where you completely lose trust between different sectors. And as frightening as his representation is, kind of the punchline, which I cannot quote verbatim, but literally the punchline of his joke when he shoots the talk show host. By the way, did you remember David Endricken in Dark Knight Returns? In the last book, I believe it is, where the Joker shows up on what's thinly disguised as the David Letterman show and kills the audience. I can't help but think when this movie was written, the Joker, somebody had that in mind when they're trying to tell another Joker origin story, because we have a very similar setup where he goes on to a national talk show and then he says, basically, correct me if you've got the actual quote, but what do you get when you cross a society that doesn't care with mental illness? And the punchline is, he puts a bullet in the entertainer's head and starts this mass riot where all these disenfranchised people, the people who feel like there's no way to win in the current system, are content to destroy. And here he is. I mean, I just can't think of any example of superheroes being used more currently to represent some positionality in a very current crisis about governance and about equality and these kind of things. So I think a perfect wrap up to what we've been talking about for the last 6 episodes is that these characters don't just exist in graphic novels. They exist as symbols of what people are feeling in real life right now, in a positive way, as Brian is talking about, when they want to celebrate that character, but also as something a lot darker. I'd be very interested in what the panel thinks about what I see as sort of the ascendancy of Joker. The Joker character, partly because of Joaquin Phoenix's powerful performance, but more generally, notice that the Joker has kind of achieved he's the head of the pantheon of Batman villains and has become this object of contemplation in his own right, even as far back as Alan Moore's follow-up to Dark Knight, The Killing Joke. He becomes sort of a main character in his own right, seems to stand for something, a certain kind of a despair or chaos in the societal response.
Well, I certainly think, having watched the recent Joker film, that we can interpret it as a cautionary tale of what will happen if we don't, well, get our together as a culture, right? If we don't address these issues, if we don't tackle them, this is what could happen. And it's a great point of starting a conversation about mental illness, about perceptions of reality. But I really do think it's an opportunity for us to also delve into like that deeper, darker psyche, and spend some time as a society asking, well, is this what we really want if we continue to act in denial of mental illness? And so I really like to interpret that Joker as a cautionary tale, a psychological thriller that's supposed to make us feel anxious and make us feel and evoke that sense from the safety of our theater seats. And I do think, though, that it taps into this idea of feeling unseen and unheard. I certainly do feel that way in terms of having recently watched it.
Kyle, I suspect you have a couple of thoughts, and just transitioning to you, I would add, this is a film, Joker, Todd dropping his name right now, director Todd Phillips film. It received an enormous ovation at Cannes, immediately followed by American film critics writing, "Do not release this film." We do not need this film right now, right? They created a social warning around it, like, should theaters even accept playing this film, which is like a mainstream Warner Brothers production, right? Well, fast forward, it goes on to gross $1 billion, like the highest grossing R-rated feature ever. I mean, we're not adjusting for inflation, but I'll be the first to admit, I always knew I would check it out. I absolutely stayed away from it. And by the time I saw it, I was in like an empty theater with two other people, and I was feeling uncomfortable. And sometimes some of that's like media effects, but some of it's just understanding the history of what happens when pulp culture intersects and starts to blend with reality. Because we've already talked about the Aurora shooting that coincided with the premiere of The Dark Knight Rises. I remember I still went on a opening weekend and was incredibly kind of nervous and looking at the exits during that screening. And this was the first time we were seeing armed security guards at a movie theater. It wasn't even in a mall. It was like a separate movie theater. And we're seeing this kind of presence, and it kind of like, this was the tail end of when you get in line in advance to see the movie. So you show up way early, and you kind of mob flock to your seats and pick them as you go. Well, they've altered all of that over the years, right? Various factors have played a role. But this now you just choose your seat and show up later. It has economic incentives, but we lost something culturally. But this is a very polarizing film. I appreciate Karen's approach to it. I'm shocked by the image you shared, Scott, because wasn't that character kind of reappropriated by certain groups in culture, right, that want to make that Joker image into their own? There is a kind of white male culture, to just use sort of colloquial concepts, the incel, right? This idea of the alienated, overburdened, almost infantile in a way, or like repressed white male presence. So shocking to kind of see that being flipped and reimagined in a real life, in a real world social protest situation. Obviously, horrendous events have continue to unfurl yet again. I've been in the thick of this course, so the first things I'm thinking of is the habitual state of unrest with Gotham citizens. And Dark Knight Returns, we're constantly being brought back to ground level, and the sheer panic and fear and trauma that the citizens, right, that the street level working person experiences, right? The level of criminality, crime, the rampancy, but by book's end, we're seeing a kind of social disturbance totally unfurled. And here we go again, right? Seeing an event that gets accelerated through mass media and now through social media just lead to really a nationwide dialogue. And sometimes these dialogues are civil, sometimes they're uncivil and violent. Kyle, did you have thoughts you wanted to add to that area I've left off?
I don't know that I have anything especially insightful to add. To be really transparent with you, I'm still, there are several very radically different interpretive communities that have latched on to the Joker movie, and so I'm still kind of working through my own feelings toward it. I was fairly uncomfortable at the end of the movie in the theater. I think at best and most optimistically among the interpretations is we have the sort of cautionary tale kind of hermeneutic approach, and that's, I think, to me, that's probably the best possible approach to it. It's the sort of thing that probably leads to the kind of activity that we see in the images that Scott is showing there, and so I like that interpretation. It's also a little nerve-wracking that, as you mentioned earlier, I've taken an interest in kind of extreme groups, and that includes doomsday cults, and it's also included white nationalism recently. And because this movie is abstract enough that many different sorts of people who feel oppressed have been able to latch onto it, we have also seen, and I'm working on writing an essay about this right now, we are also seeing on white nationalist websites and in their community forums, a lot of those folks seem galvanized by this movie to increase their activity as well. And so we see things that appear to be pro-social and socially productive happening based on people's interpretation of the character and of this particular movie, but we also have what I would think of as co-option of the character in certain communities who are maybe latching on to more antisocial desires and attributing those to the film as well. So it's complicated. I don't know if we've seen any sort of consistent interpretation of the movie yet.
I noticed Garrett and Kyle both used the words reappropriation, reinterpretation. You know, if anything, those are both keys to the fact that it's still relevant. People don't bother to reinterpret stuff that's not relevant. So if the whole point of this course, Garrett, was to try and establish that The Dark Knight Returns is relevant to real life issues, is a relevant piece of literature, then I think that point is so well established by the way it's being used, either appropriated or reappropriated or reconfigured or reimagined in culture all the time, not just Batman, but the villain, the Robin or Joker here, are relevant medium of exchange. They're an exchange of ideas in the flesh. So it's in a culture where, as we have all bemoaned, no one is likely to pick up Moby Dick and read it, even though maybe there was never a whole lot of people that were likely to pick up Moby Dick and read it. These perform a powerful function as literature in shaping ideas and helping people express their aspirations, but also their frustrations with with their own lives.
I'm reminded of the lack of success in Miller's follow-up, The Dark Knight Strikes Again, and the increasingly fascistic tones it takes on, the kind of extremist nature of Batman. First of all, it's disappointing because the open-ended, the artfulness of the original gives us enough without telling us, and that in itself is a hopeful abstraction of art and a soulful reflection of society and these iconic characters, with any sort of economic engine, that you can milk something to death and take it in a direction that's unideal for everyone. But if I'm going to pull a silver lining out of Miller's subsequent follow-ups, it's that, make us think about the hyper radical nature of our decisions and use that as meditative tools to be able to also question ourselves and our own desires when we seek that that super savior. We've been reading, I didn't go through our pull list in the class with the group, but in addition to Dark Knight Rises, we've used Chris Gaviler's Superhero Comics, which is a great readerly, it's very reader friendly work from Bloomsbury, and then Old Reliable, in an entirely nostalgic text for me, relatively obscure to a lot of people in academia, but I bet some of our guests would recognize it. The Myth of the American Superhero from John Shelton Lawrence and Robert Jewett, a callback, but the argument they're making is we have a society that is seeking these replacement sort of secular super saviors, and we want or crave, at least from a narrative perspective, that they have an ability to utilize righteous violence, and yet not be drawn over to the dark side. And this is, of course, it's all delving into the mythological here, just like Luke Skywalker. That's the ultimate fantasies, that we can wield such power and authority, and if necessary through violent means, and yet still have enough soulful self-control that we don't teeter over to the dark side. I suspect that the kind of cautionary tale we cannot come to a simple conclusion on in a single conversation, and societally will continue to wrestle with this on into the future. What we can hopefully bring from this, and certainly through the increased volume of recent protests, like I believe we're seeing an increased effort to speak out against the unlawful use of excessive force, to be just incredibly specific, but also a changed mindset into what is a systemic historical use of prioritizing maybe certain cultural enclaves over others, and that it's not going to be resolved at once. It's the problems can be exacerbated by social media, and not just by those in authority, but by those of us that use it as a kind of impromptu pedestal. And so there's a lot to reflect on, and I think a great service we can provide is to be able to draw attention to these conversations, to be able to have them in the classrooms, and I try to use that classroom as a sacred space. I know others do as well. It's a necessary place to have it. In fact, too often we're getting to that point of hyperpolarization, where you can't have the fruitful discussion at Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving has become the new internet meme, right? You can't talk to your backwooted uncle or what have you anymore. It's too volatile. And so I think we have to actively look for the spaces where we can have these healthy dialogues. I mean, I've seen a real inclusive space at New World over the years. I mean, this is a place where people are sort of welcomed and celebrated, and I think the classroom is another space like that, and even the scholarly space, right? It's a non-space space. It's a place where we're having conversations over a period of years, whether or not it is double-blind, peer-reviewed, or whatever, right? Some of those shackles are starting to fall away as well. And for media studies, at least, it's a fruitful place. I would love if everyone has any kind of final word or recommendations or anything on the horizon. You certainly have active scholars, classes on the horizon, opportunities you would love to be able to share with us or champion as we close out. I just want to provide that platform for you all, and of course, just thank you immensely for taking a considerable amount of time at a prime time of the day. Appreciate that. Let's go around. Who can we begin with here? Kyle, what's on deck for you?
So my interests are increasingly gravitating toward extreme thought and disinformation and misinformation. So the work that I have hopefully on the horizon soon will be concentrated in that area and on cultural myths. And as that applies to Bat-Man, as I kind of previewed earlier, I am currently working on an essay about white nationalist co-option of Bat-Man stories. And so I think that hopefully will connect to a larger conversation about mythic signs and symbols in American culture right now. And in case students are interested in further reading on any of these things, if I can do a shameless self-plug, I have a couple of essays with my brother in the Phoenix Papers that might be relevant to some of the topics we talked about. One is about the Flash, and it has to do with the recursive relationship between audiences and authors in producing comics. And I have also written about Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's run on Batman in a couple of articles there, if folks are interested in that. Travis Langley has great work out on Batman and psychology, if any students are interested in following up on that. And finally, a communication scholar just released a book on, it's called Fandom for the Love of Politics by Dr. Ashley Hink. And of course, it addresses how folks in various fandoms use these icons, and part of her work includes superheroes there, to sort of represent their own politics and to help them engage in dialogue about politics. So again, thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me a moment to plug all of that. And this was a lot of fun.
This is awesome. And not to cut anyone off, thank you, Kyle. We're looking for that. Scott, you're back to back with another meeting right after this. So any final words as you're heading off?
Well, just as a regular contributor, just wanted to say thank you so much. I've learned a whole lot from listening to people who have spent a lot more time, either academically or commercially, with this storyline. And if you can enthuse me as you have to be to pay more attention to the whole world of the graphic novel and these storylines, then you can enthuse anyone. I think we're always looking for ways to connect with another generation of students. The ways that we cherished are in many cases just no longer valued. And this appears to be one that has a lot of promise in that direction. And I look forward to further collaboration along these lines. I think it's very productive. It's very good for students. I'm proud that Garrett has taken the initiative to create this kind of a reusable artifact in courses where students can find another way to connect over material that they have. It's been traditionally difficult for them to do the kind of reading that maybe we always we did as undergraduates, and so this is another way, and a very viable way through broadband communication to do that.
Thank you, Scott. And Brian, or Buck, as you often go by, and we didn't do a full identity reveal on the episode, but we saved it for a twist ending here at the end. Yeah. Oh, you were there all along. I think a great service. You were someone I saw a voice online, quick to adopt and adapt to a curbside pickup, finding ways to be helpful, provide a community service, but also, be able to kind of, move product during an extremely anxious time, I think those of us in higher education have been fortunate and lucky. There's a lot of strife. This, what we're seeing is a result of one thing right now. There's been anxiety after anxiety bubbling up. Grateful that you've been doing some curbside service. I tried to recommend some of the students that didn't listen and go get their books on time were needing last minute recommendations, and I definitely reminded them of locations like yours that could assist them with that. I'm sure you always have a Dark Knight Returns on hand.
Yes.
But tell us, are you back to normal hours or some modified hours, or what can we know about New World in the coming days?
Yeah, currently we're back to normal hours. We're taking our various safety precautions, making sure that we wipe down everything. As soon as I'm done with this call, I'm going to throw my mask back on. And it's just kind of how I run the business and live my life. Is, if I'm reading all about these superheroes or who are out to take care of the world and make it a better place, I better do the same. So that's why, as soon as we heard, how awful this thing was, I shut down the store and didn't let people in, and we made it strictly curbside and delivery. And, as things are needed of me, I'm going to do everything I can to help the community and help better anyone I can throughout this. So I think that's just kind of everyone's social obligation, but I think that's a topic for a completely different discussion.
This is true. If I should have picked Batman Contagion as the graphic novel to look at during this COVID-19 era of a continuous mass media parent, but the through lines were there. It has been one of those optimal experiences for better and for worse. You don't wish these kinds of experiences on anyone, and we'll be grappling with the after effects for quite some time, but glad that you're taking those precautions. It's a relief to hear that when businesses are like that kind of crisis communication. We talk about this in communication studies all the time. That kind of crisis communication is essential. It's important. Being able to have that relationship with your stakeholders is significant, and so on. Karen, it has been great to have you in here and have you share and impart your wisdom and just such a level of empathy passed on. What are you up to, and what's on the horizon for you?
Well, I think for me, it's just a matter of continuing to keep my pulse on popular culture through my two teenagers. They are my new source of all things popular culture since I'm old. And to continue to incorporate that into my classes and encourage others to incorporate that into their classes who teach with me, because I do think that in the era of short attention span, popular culture like Batman can speak to our students and provide relevant opportunities to really have dialogue about the world around us. And so I just continue to keep on fighting the good fight and trying to make popular culture.
I'll second that. And thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for really investing this time for us. Whether it's not your university or not your classroom, I want you to feel welcome here and just know that you're providing an important service, as well as Buck and others incredibly grateful. We represent a very unique space to be able to integrate and share with others in this way. And one of the exciting things is Scott and I both kind of share this intuition that, there is mighty change occurring in higher ed, and a lot of it creates anxiety for people, but there's a real opportunity to reinvent and be innovative right now. Certainly your presence here, just part of this experiment, is testimony to that. We appreciate it. Students, I feel like we've accomplished our mission and then some. Some of the things we couldn't have anticipated. What's great about that is at times it can create the greatest of learning experiences, right? We realized there were new ways of learning and applying that were never there before, or were there hiding all along. It has been fantastic working through the master text, The Dark Knight Returns, from Frank Miller and Lynn Varney and company, right? Throughout this course, we'll bid it a fond adieu. And since we're closing out our second season of Special Topics, I have post-credits teaser. None of our students will be able to appreciate it because they can't re-enroll in the same class. We all know this. But in the fall, assuming we are able to resume relatively consistent on-ground practices, our goal is to have an on-ground accelerated experience of this course. And we will be shifting themes once again in our Special Topics in Media Studies course, COM 4103. The season 3 theme would be future shock cinema, and we're going to look at some science fiction that tackles the what ifs and the possibilities, projecting a kind of future that straddles that line between utopia and dystopia, and how that resonates with real world anxieties. And if we look back at some of those former artifacts from decades past, we'll explore how prescient they've become, right? Sometimes we can laugh and just appreciate the absurdity of their extreme misses. But wow, when something stands out as having come true in a different kind of way, it's really something. So we're going to look at some media artifacts really spanning numerous decades. I think 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. And that's going to be a special experience. We've been slowly curating this. It's been an idea that's been in incubation phase for a couple of years. And we're ready to, it was always ready, but it's time to kind of use debate terms here, pull the trigger on this and let it loose. It's going to be very exciting. Once again, showering our panelists with praise and thank yous. It's been an honor to have them on board with us to close out our season 2 finale of Special Topics in Media Studies. Our emphasis this course, Mythic Media in America. Look forward to feedback from our audience, students or subscribers at large, and look forward to future conversations to come. Thank you for listening.
Special Topics in Media is a production in cooperation with Mid-America Christian University. Special Topics is produced by Garrett Castleberry, Executive Advisor Scott McMurray, Audio Engineer Will McMurray, Graphic Design Logo by Corey Fuller, Music composed by Austin Foster. Special Topics is produced in coordination with the Communication, Media, and Ethics program at Mid-America Christian University.